Welcome back to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. It is the kitchen table series because it is a Friday, and today we are going to unveil deck number 42 in MTG Burgeoning's longest running series. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at an Abzan Persist deck. Hello and welcome back, MTG Burgeoning community. Here we are again with another deck tech for the Kitchen Table series. We are up to deck number 42 in what is the channel's longest running content series. Brace yourselves for this deck, folks, because we are going to take a shot at a very unfair deck for our opponents. Not so much for us, but it will be for our opponents. So, as it generally is customary here during our Kitchen Table series, let's begin the deck with the mana base. And there's not going to be many frills? Nothing special about this mana base, folks. We're playing Abzan, but we're more concentrated on a couple of colors than all three. So let's get out with our basic lands first. We got 5 basic plains. And we're going to have 5 basic forests, and we're going to have 5 basic swamps. So a nice even cut of 15 basic lands for the 3 colors that we're going to have represented in this Abzan build. And then we're going to throw in 6 check lands. We're going to have 3 copies of Sun Petal Grove. That's the Selesnyan check land, of course, because we are trying to get our green-white as high as we possibly can. And also we're going to include Woodland Cemetery, 3 copies of that. That's going to be our Golgari check land. All right, so those are going to be the lands that are included in this Abzan build. And to top it off, because we're a kitchen table deck, we have 1 copy of course, Sol Ring. We're playing at the kitchen table. We're playing free-for-all, so of course that's going to be one of the cards included. All right, so as we said, this is an Abzan Persist deck. So what we want to do is we want to find ways, very reliable ways, to get these Persist creatures into our graveyard. So what we're going to look at next are going to be a set of cards that are going to act as our sacrifice outlets for our Persist creatures. We're going to start off with a playset of Carrion Feeder. It costs 1 black. It's a 1/1. It can't block, so it's useless. However, we can sacrifice a creature to it to put a +1/+1 counter on him. And that's what we're looking to do. We want to get our Persist creatures into the graveyard and then right back out. And then back in, and then back out, and then back in, and then back out. But you'll be able to connect those dots as we continue with this deck tech. 4 copies of Carrion Feeder. Another playset of another playset sacrifice outlet is going to be 4 copies, of course, of Altar of Dementia. Way back to the days of Tempest is when this artifact first debuted. For 2 CMC, we sacrifice a creature, and target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrifice creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. This is going to be a lot more beneficial for us than just sacrificing our Persist creatures to the Carrion Feeder, because the Altar of Dementia could act as a win condition. This isn't Commander, this is just regular kitchen table free-for-all, so our opponent's decks are beginning at 60 cards. So sacrificing and then sacrificing and then sacrificing to the Altar of Dementia, we should be able to mill out our opponents with great ease. 4 copies of Altar of Dementia. And our last sacrifice outlet, we are going to play with another playset of an artifact with a mana value of 2 called Spawning Pit. We sacrifice a creature and we can put a charge counter on Spawning Pit. Then we can tap 1 and remove 2 charge counters from Spawning Pit to create a 2/2 spawn artifact creature token. Unfortunately, the 2/2 spawn artifact creature token does not exist. It is one of those cards for which Wizards has yet to create a token. However, for the purposes of this deck, any die with the number 2 on it will be just fine. 4 copies of Spawning Pit, bringing our grand total of sacrifice outlets in this deck up to 12. It is the most important feature after our Persist creatures. All right, so now let's go with our Persist Creatures. Let's start unrolling them. We have some select creatures here. Now, the deck is not inundated with Persist Creatures. We have we have 2 play sets of the ones we want in order to either win the game or make it so it's nearly impossible for our opponents to do so. So let's show the creatures first. We're going to play with a play set of Kitchen Finks. So it's a mana value of 1 and any combination of 2 Selesnya mana. Come on, camera, get in the game. There we go. And it has Persist, and when it enters the battlefield, we gain 2 life. So for any in the audience that are unfamiliar with the Persist mechanic, which debuted back during the time of Shadowmoor, Persist is when a creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So for the purposes of clarity, when the Kitchen Finks is on the battlefield, we sacrifice it with the Altar of Dementia. It goes to the graveyard as a 3/2. It returns from the graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it, making it a 2/1. If it were to be sacrificed or hits the graveyard again through combat or direct damage or some destruction spell, then it will stay in the graveyard because there was a -1/-1 counter on it. We're going to talk about the -1/-1 counters a little bit later in this deck tech, but for the purposes of what we're trying to do with our Persist creatures, we will have the ability of Kitchen Finks to gain us an infinite amount of life. And if we have an Altar of Dementia in play, and our opponents are not playing with any of the automatic shuffle graveyard cards that are not abundant, but there are enough copies out there for it to be a problematic feature, then we can win the game with that combination. More on that as we continue with this deck tech. 4 copies of Kitchen Finks. All right, our next Persist creature is going to be a full playset of Murderous Redcap. For 2 colorless and any 2 combination of Rakdos colors, it's a 2/2 that when it ETBs, it deals 2 damage to any target. And it has the Persist mechanic. So we cast it, it enters the battlefield, shocks something. It hits the graveyard, returns from the graveyard with a -1/-1 counter on it, and shocks something again. All right, 4 copies, Murderous Redcap. And lastly, a few more Persist creatures, not a full playset, but we are going to play with 3 of them. We are going to include 3 copies of Puppeteer Click. It's 3 and 2 black for a 3/2 flying fairy wizard, and when it enters the battlefield, we may put target creature from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. It gains haste, and at the beginning of our next end step, we exile it. And it also, of course, has the Persist mechanic. So we have a way in which to thwart potential graveyard shenanigans of our opponents by getting their creature cards out of the graveyard into play for us for a turn, attack someone with it, and then they become exiled. 3 copies of Puppeteer Click. All right, so those are the 11 Persist creatures and the 12 sacrifice outlets. So, you ask, how is this engine going to win the game for us consistently? Well, in the presence of any one of the following cards, we'll be able to create a loop that we can continuously sacrifice an ETB with our Persist creatures without having to worry about any -1/-1 counters. And how we're going to accomplish that, we're going to include a playset of Vizier of Remedies. It's a 2/1 human cleric for 1 and a white. If 1 or more -1/-1 counters would be put on a creature we control, that many -1/-1 counters -1 are put on it instead. So for the purposes of clarity, when we sacrifice or when one of our Persist creatures hits the graveyard, if a copy of Vizier of Remedies is in play, the creature hits the graveyard, the Persist mechanic triggers, it returns to the graveyard, it goes to put a -1/-1 counter on it, but Vizier of Remedies ability will prevent that from happening. So the creature will return to the battlefield with no -1/-1 counters on it. So as long as Vizier of Remedies is in play, we can continuously sacrifice any of these Persist creatures to any of our sacrifice outlets and not have to worry about the -1/-1 counters that Vizier of Remedies will prevent. 4 copies of this white human cleric. another play set just for the purposes of redundancy in this deck, because we're trying to establish an infinite graveyard to battlefield synergy and battlefield to graveyard synergy. We're going to include 4 copies of Melira Sylvic Outcast. 1 in a green for a 2/2. We can't get poison counters. Benefit. Creatures we control can't have -1/-1 counters placed on them. So in a way, this is like another full play set of Vizier of Remedies, pardon me, for the purposes of what this deck wants to do. And creatures our opponents control lose infect. I mean, I don't think there's a great deal to worry about the infect, but I mean, it's a bonus that's tied into the text of Melira. More importantly, however, is that creatures we control can't have -1/-1 counters placed on them. So having 4 more copies of a creature that will allow our Persist creatures to return from the graveyard to the battlefield and not have to worry about the -1/-1 counters, that just adds additional redundancy. So as you can see, we're stacking our cards in such a way that we have our 12 sacrifice engines, we have our 11 persist creatures, and now we have so far 8 creatures that can stop and prevent the -1/-1 counters from being put onto our persist creatures, which will allow us to continuously sacrifice them and bring them back to the graveyard, or bring them back from the graveyard. The very last card that we're going to include as a way in which to, skirt around the persist mechanic, that will be 1 copy of Solemnity. It's an enchantment from Hour of Devastation. It's got a mana value of 2 and a white, and it says players can't get counters. Again, not too big of a concern for us. However, it also says counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So for the purposes of this deck, again, this is just another card that will stop the persist mechanic from putting -1/-1 counters on a creature when they return from the graveyard. So we have 9 different instances in which we can prevent that from happening. And for the purposes of trying to get this engine online, because we need to have a persist creature, preferably the Murderous Redcap, that would work, or an Altar of Dementia as our sacrifice outlet, then it won't matter which persist creature we have. And we need to have one of these 2 creatures, or the Solemnity, excuse me, just in order to make sure that we can acquire the pieces of our engine. We're going to include a couple copies of Eladamri's Call. A green and a white, at instant speed, we can search our library for a creature card, reveal that card, and then put it into our hand. So end of turn or during turn, we can cast Eladamri's Call and search out for one of the missing pieces we need for our engine. And we are almost done with this 40-second deck tech, as we are committed to an engine that is having creatures leave the battlefield, go to the graveyard, come back to the battlefield, back to the graveyard, back to the battlefield, like a wonderful rally in tennis or ping pong. We're going to include 4 copies of Desecrated Tomb just as a potential win condition. It's an artifact with a mana value of 3, and whenever 1 or more creature cards leave our graveyard, we create a 1/1 black creature token, 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. So how this would work is we could have our persist creature sitting out there on the battlefield. We sacrifice it to one of our many sacrifice outlets. The persist mechanic triggers. It leaves the graveyard. We create a bat. We sacrifice the persist creature again. It goes to the graveyard. The persist mechanic kicks in again. We create a bat. And the best part about this is that we can do all of these things during our opponent's end step. So we can do all of this sacrificing and all of this bringing back and make all of these bats that we can untap and attack and win the game. 4 copies of Desecrated Tomb. And there you have it, MTG Burgeoning Community. Kitchen Table Series deck number 42, Abzan Persist. Let me know what you think of this nasty deck in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.